Here he is, friends. He got his suit back just in time. And no matter what happens in his life, he gets absolutely no respect.
There were people I welcomed on air with a smile, even though in my mind I already knew they were truly cruel individuals. For more than 3 decades sitting in the host's chair of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson came face to face with the most powerful figures in Hollywood, names the American public adored and trusted without question. In front of the cameras, they joked effortlessly, told wholesome stories, and projected flawless images. But when the studio lights went out, Carson witnessed moments the audience was never meant to see. Moments that taught him how easily fame could conceal something deeply disturbing. He saw one legendary star physically assault their own staff so severely, the victim had to be hospitalized. He watched a celebrated female icon praised as a moral role model quietly manipulate young actors into calculated, self-serving relationships. And most bitter of all, Carson once hosted a beloved comedian known for fundraising shows for children. A man who spoke passionately about compassion on air, yet backstage openly treated black children with discrimination and contempt. And today, we will trace the list of guests from Hollywood's golden age whom Johnny Carson himself believed had hidden their true faces for far too long. Frank Sinatra, when power outweighed talent. If he hadn't become a singer, he would have been a mob enforcer. That wasn't a line from a tabloid. It was something Johnny Carson muttered to a close friend after the cameras were off, the audience had left the studio, and Frank Sinatra was no longer standing under the lights. To the public, Frank Sinatra embodied everything America once worshipped: a flawless voice, masculine charm, the soft power of a cultural icon. On The Tonight Show, he appeared as a familiar guest, relaxed, joking easily, sometimes even breaking into song to thunderous applause. Johnny Carson smiled. Ed McMahon laughed along. On screen, they looked like old friends reunited after years apart. But the people working behind the scenes knew better. That smile wasn't warmth. It was restraint. According to longtime Tonight Show staff, whenever Frank Sinatra was booked, the atmosphere in the studio changed instantly. He never arrived alone. 6 to 8 men always accompanied him, not showbiz assistants, but figures whose presence made crew members avoid eye contact. One cameraman later described the feeling as working under the watch of men who didn't need to say much. The breaking point came in the early 1970s at NBC Studios in Burbank. During what was supposed to be a routine taping, a floor manager, a man in his 50s, a Korean War veteran, did his job and informed Sinatra that his segment had 3 minutes remaining. It was standard procedure. Nothing more. Sinatra didn't see it that way. Multiple witnesses later recalled Sinatra grabbing the man by the tie, pulling him close and snarling, "No one tells me I have 3 minutes. I go on when I'm ready." The man froze. No one intervened. And in the office behind the set, Johnny Carson was watching everything unfold on the monitor. Carson went pale. He nearly canceled the entire segment on the spot. Only when producers reminded him that Sinatra meant massive ratings did Carson reluctantly allow the show to continue. When the cameras rolled again, Carson still smiled. Sinatra kept joking. But from that moment on, everyone backstage noticed something unmistakable. Johnny Carson's smile had changed. It was no longer respect. It was endurance. A few weeks later, during another taping, Sinatra crossed a line Carson couldn't ignore. Loud enough for others to hear, he made a degrading remark about the appearance of a female backstage staffer. This time, Carson didn't look away. He turned to Sinatra, his voice low and cold. "We don't talk about my staff like that here." The studio went silent. Sinatra, accustomed to no one ever pushing back, sat stunned for a rare few seconds. When the red light came back on, both men resumed their on-air roles. But after the taping, Carson spoke bluntly to the producers. "I don't care how good his ratings are. Limit him to once a year. Maximum." It was an extraordinary decision. Johnny Carson almost never interfered with guest bookings. He especially never restricted an icon of Sinatra's magnitude. But for Carson, this wasn't about a star's ego. It was about how power reveals a person's true nature when they believe no one will dare say no. Years later, when Sinatra's name came up in private conversations, Carson rarely elaborated. He would simply say one line that those who heard it never forgot. Sometimes I think he was a great singer, and exactly the kind of man you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. And if Frank Sinatra shattered Carson's faith in the myth of masculine glamour, the next name on his list chilled him for a very different reason. Not aggression, but a kind of coldness that felt almost inhuman. Because after Frank Sinatra, Johnny Carson encountered Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford, perfection without humanity. I've seen dead people with more emotion than her. Johnny Carson never said that line on air. He said it after the cameras were off, after the audience had gone home, and after Joan Crawford had left the studio with that flawless smile still fixed on her face. It wasn't a remark born out of impulse. It was a cold conclusion from a man who had observed long enough and close enough to understand that sometimes the most frightening thing in Hollywood isn't rage, but emptiness, disguised as discipline and glamour. Joan Crawford didn't need to enter a room to command attention. She only needed to stand still. Her posture was perfectly upright. Her gaze angled just slightly above the person in front of her, enough to make everyone else feel subtly beneath her. For decades, Hollywood called that class. The public called it presence. The camera adored her with near total devotion. When she appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, American audiences saw exactly what they expected, the untarnished queen of old Hollywood. Every gesture calculated, every smile timed precisely. Not a glance wasted, not a breath out of rhythm. Joan Crawford spoke as if every answer had been prepared years in advance. Johnny Carson had interviewed every type imaginable: drunks, narcissist stars shaking with insecurity. But with Joan Crawford, he sensed something entirely different. There was no anxiety, no nervousness, no genuine emotion. Only a performance so perfect it felt inhuman. According to backstage staff, things had already gone off balance before Crawford even arrived. Her team sent The Tonight Show an unusually long list of demands. The lighting had to hit at a specific angle. The chair had to recline at an exact degree. Carson's desk had to be raised to a certain height, and the room temperature precisely 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The show's technical director kept that list for years afterward, not because it mattered, but because he had never seen anyone obsessively control details to that extent. Crawford arrived nearly 3 hours early, bringing her own makeup team despite the show having top-tier professionals. But even that wasn't what Johnny Carson remembered most. The moment that mattered happened in the dressing room. A young production assistant, barely in her 20s, still learning where to stand and how to move, was assigned to bring water to the room. She stepped inside, and before she could finish her sentence, the atmosphere shifted completely. It wasn't an uncontrolled outburst. There was no shouting, no chaos. It was a calculated verbal assault, cold and deliberate as if rehearsed. Joan Crawford called the girl stupid, useless. Then, in a voice so calm it was chilling, she suggested the young woman should find work at a brothel where incompetence might be more acceptable. The hallway outside fell silent. Those who overheard froze in place. The assistant broke down, fled in tears. Crawford turned to her staff and ordered that the girl be fired immediately. The producers refused, quietly, without argument. But from that moment on, an invisible line had been drawn. Minutes later, the red light came on. Joan Crawford walked onto the stage wearing the same flawless smile, gentle eyes, a soft, elegant voice. The audience had no idea that moments earlier, the same woman had completely shattered a young employee. During the commercial break, the smile vanished instantly. Crawford sat in silence, speaking to no one, like a statue placed at the center of the set. The red light came back on, and she came alive. smiling, nodding, perfectly charming. After the show, Johnny Carson turned to Ed McMahon and said something no one present ever forgot. "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Mommy Dearest exposed allegations of abuse against Crawford's adopted children, Carson wasn't surprised. He simply said, "I saw who she really was in those few hours." In Johnny Carson's eyes, Joan Crawford was no longer a queen. She became proof of a chilling truth: when someone lives too long inside perfection, what disappears isn't their flaws, but their humanity. But if Joan Crawford unsettled Carson with her polished emptiness, the next name on his list brought a different kind of exhaustion. A towering ego convinced that no rules applied to him. Because after Joan Crawford, Johnny Carson had to deal with Orson Welles. Orson Welles, when genius no longer knows its limits. He didn't come to be interviewed, he came to be worshipped. That was what Johnny Carson said to Ed McMahon after a taping that ended with Carson leaving the studio in silence, an unusual silence for the man who had controlled American television for over 3 decades. In Hollywood history, Orson Welles was no ordinary name. He was a genius, a prodigy, the man who made Citizen Kane before turning 30 and was thereafter hailed as the greatest mind in American cinema. His voice was deep, resonant, commanding. When Welles spoke, rooms fell quiet. When Orson Welles appeared on The Tonight Show during Carson's era, viewers saw exactly what they expected: a living legend. Brilliant, witty, overflowing with stories from Hollywood's golden age. On air, Carson laughed at the right moments. The audience applauded. Television captured a historic moment, but backstage, everything was different. According to multiple writers and producers from The Tonight Show, problems with Orson Welles never began on stage. They began in the preparation room. As was standard practice, the writing team sent guests a list of topics and questions in advance, a framework that allowed Carson to guide the conversation smoothly within live television's strict time limits. Welles glanced at the pages, then did something that stunned the room. He took a pen and crossed out everything. No edits, no suggestions. He struck it all. Then he pushed the nearly blank sheet back and said the questions were trivial and obvious. In his view, they were beneath him. That placed Johnny Carson in a rare and uncomfortable position. Carson was meticulous. He controlled the rhythm of the show down to the second. But with Welles, he was forced to step onto the stage without a map, armed only with an enormous name and an even larger ego. And exactly as the staff feared, things quickly spiraled out of control. In the mid-1970s, during a taping where Orson Welles was scheduled for 7 minutes, he sat down in the familiar guest chair and simply didn't get up. His first answer ran long, the second longer. Then Welles drifted into endless stories. Europe theater politics, fragmented memories only he seemed to find relevant. Johnny Carson signaled. He tapped his pen, shifted posture, glanced toward the producers. Welles noticed all of it and ignored it completely. 7 minutes passed. 10. 15. Eventually, Orson Welles occupied nearly 25 minutes of airtime. The result: 2 other guests were cut entirely from that night's show. No apology, no acknowledgement. Welles stood, shook hands, and left as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But it didn't end there. According to multiple crew members, Orson Welles refused to address production assistants directly. Instead of saying, "Could I have some water?" "Please," he would say, "Tell that girl to bring water." Instead of requesting an adjustment, he would order, "Have that boy fix the lights," even when the person stood right next to him. For Carson, this was deeply irritating, not because of ego, but because he held an unspoken rule. The Tonight Show was not a guest's stage. It was a collective effort. Orson Welles didn't see it that way. On another appearance, he brought his own props, changed topics without warning, and even stood up mid-interview to direct camera angles, as if NBC's studio were his personal film set. One producer recalled Johnny didn't say anything. but you could see him boiling. After that taping, Johnny Carson turned to Ed McMahon and said quietly but clearly, "Genius doesn't give anyone the right to hijack someone else's show." It wasn't an outburst, it was a verdict. Carson, who was famously tolerant of eccentricity, gradually came to view Orson Welles as a cautionary lesson. That talent, when left unchecked, can become something that devours everything around it. Respect other people's time and even the basic structure of a television program. Publicly, Carson continued to praise Welles as a cinematic legend, but behind the scenes, the name Orson Welles was quietly placed into a category of guests Carson no longer looked forward to. Not because he hated Welles, but because he had seen something far more dangerous, a man who believed himself above all rules. Years later, when people asked Johnny Carson what kind of guest was the most difficult to handle, he never mentioned drunks. He never mentioned divas. He simply said, "The ones who think genius gives them the right not to stop." Orson Welles became the clearest example of that truth. But if Welles's ego left Carson exhausted and angry, the next name on the list brought a very different kind of discomfort. Not intellectual arrogance, but cruelty disguised as a strong personality. Because after Orson Welles, Johnny Carson had to face Bette Davis. Bette Davis. Great talent could not save her from bitterness. She didn't converse, she interrogated. That was how Johnny Carson described Bette Davis after a taping he walked away from with an unusually tense expression. For Carson, a man who had dealt with every kind of Hollywood ego, this wasn't a joke. It was a concise indictment. In the history of American cinema, Bette Davis was a monument. 2 Academy Awards, a string of legendary performances, a sharp, uncompromising style that made Hollywood both admire and fear her. The public called it a strong personality. The press praised her as a woman who refused to compromise. And for years, that myth shielded behavior few dared to name. When Bette Davis appeared on The Tonight Show, viewers saw exactly what they expected: intelligent, caustic, razor-sharp. Her stories were tightly paced, expertly landed. Laughter arrived on cue. On air, she was the perfect Bette Davis. But behind the scenes, another person emerged. According to longtime staffers, the issue with Bette Davis wasn't a single incident. It was a pattern repeated long enough for Carson to realize this wasn't an accident, but character. On episodes with multiple guests, Davis frequently interrupted others mid-sentence, especially if they were younger or female. On one occasion, as another guest was telling a story and drawing big laughs, Davis physically turned her back in her chair. Arms. Crossed eyes darkening. A guest coordinator later recalled, "You could see her calculating how to take the spotlight back. Off camera, it was worse." Davis was known for demanding alcohol in her dressing room before going on air, common enough at the time. But alcohol often loosened her restraint. One makeup artist recalled politely offering assistance only to be met with a cold remark, "Find someone else. Your hands shake like you've just quit drinking 3 days ago." No shouting, no raised voice. Just a sentence sharp enough to leave the room frozen. The breaking point came during a rehearsal when Davis began berating a cue card operator for being too slow. The language was sharp, relentless, and the studio fell silent. Everyone assumed it was just another verbal assault until Johnny Carson stood up. Carson stepped onto the stage. Calm, controlled. He looked directly at Davis and said, his voice low but unmistakably firm, "Miss Davis, on this show, we speak to one another with respect, or not at all." For a rare moment, Bette Davis froze. An unfamiliar silence settled over the studio. She was not used to being challenged, not used to being interrupted, but this time she backed down. No apology, no retaliation. She simply turned away in silence. For Carson, that was the final line. He never stopped admiring Davis's talent. But after her last appearance on The Tonight Show, Carson told a producer something very simple. Life is too short to be beaten with words, even by a legend. From that point on, Bette Davis never appeared again. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet name crossed off the list, the way Carson always handled those he no longer wished to confront. To Johnny Carson, greatness was never a license to hurt others. And Bette Davis became proof that talent, no matter how immense, cannot shield sustained cruelty. But if Bette Davis used words as weapons, the next person on Carson's list troubled him for a different reason entirely. Quiet behavior, difficult to control, that crossed boundaries with young women. Because after Bette Davis, Johnny Carson had to deal with Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney, when childhood memories become a burden. There are people America trusts by instinct, Johnny Carson once said, but I don't. Mickey Rooney was one of them. For decades, America grew up with Mickey Rooney, a legendary child star. A quick, lively face, endless energy, the embodiment of the innocence Hollywood liked to believe it once possessed. Rooney wasn't just an actor. He was collective memory. A piece of childhood replayed on screen so many times it became unquestioned. That's why when Mickey Rooney appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1970s, audiences didn't see a man to be wary of. They saw an old friend. Johnny Carson welcomed him like a living relic of Hollywood's golden age. On air, Rooney was still animated, still telling old stories with that familiar smile. Everything looked safe. But for Johnny Carson, that feeling didn't exist. Carson used to say that some guests made him alert not because they were loud, but because of how they behaved when they believed no one would dare tell them no. And Mickey Rooney, based on what Carson witnessed, was that kind of man. According to backstage staff, the moment Rooney was booked, female assistants would request to be reassigned. Not because they feared being yelled at, but because of small behaviors repeated often enough, too ambiguous to label outright, yet clear enough that no one involved could feel comfortable. Rooney had a habit of touching without invitation. When an assistant brought him water, he would hold her hand longer than necessary. When someone tried to leave, he would lightly pull her back, asking personal questions. No shouting, no brute force, just contact small enough to make the person feel uneasy and power strong enough to make her afraid to react. What bothered Johnny Carson wasn't only the behavior, it was the way Rooney acted, as if everyone had to accept it, as if fame and childhood nostalgia granted him a kind of moral immunity. One assistant later recalled he behaved like this was a privilege that came with being loved. At the same time, Rooney began appearing in an increasingly unstable state. Crew members recalled smelling alcohol in the waiting room, the same stories repeated. Thoughts breaking apart mid-sentence. The old Hollywood memories drifting past the point of harmless. The peak came in 1977. During a live taping, Mickey Rooney started telling a story about Judy Garland, his former co-star, another American childhood icon. At first, it sounded like nostalgia, but within a few sentences, the studio's mood shifted. The story turned crude, veered into inappropriate territory, and the audience fell silent. Johnny Carson glanced at the crew and then did something rare. He cut Rooney off. No joke to soften it. No polite rescue. He changed the subject immediately. When the cameras paused, Carson turned to a producer and asked one short, heavy question. Is he drunk, or is this who he really is now? After that taping, Carson did something he almost never did. He personally apologized to a young actress who had also been a guest on that episode, someone forced to sit through a conversation that had crossed the line with no power to escape it. A director later remembered Carson being very clear. That's not how a professional behaves on my show. And Carson didn't stop at words. From then on, Mickey Rooney was no longer allowed to appear live at night. If he did appear, his segment would be taped earlier in the day, tightly structured and carefully controlled. It wasn't a public punishment, it was Carson's way of protecting the show and the people working for him from an image he no longer trusted. To Carson, Mickey Rooney became a painful reminder of an uncomfortable truth. Some childhood icons are protected for so long that no one dares look directly at the person behind the memory. And when that memory finally collapses, what remains isn't innocence, only burden. Johnny Carson never called Mickey Rooney evil on air. But his decisions spoke more clearly than any accusation. Carson no longer wanted to grant Rooney the trust the public still automatically gave him. But if Mickey Rooney weighed on Carson with decline and blurred boundaries, the next name brought a different sensation entirely. Not deterioration, but chaos wrapped in glamour and laughter. Because after Mickey Rooney, Johnny Carson had to deal with someone whose every appearance left the entire studio exhausted. Her name was Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor, charm comes with chaos. Some guests walk into the studio and bring light, Johnny Carson once said. Others walk in and drain the energy out of everyone. Zsa Zsa Gabor belonged to the second group. To American audiences, Zsa Zsa Gabor was unapologetic glamour made flesh. Her thick Hungarian accent, classic beauty, and playful, half-joking manner turned every appearance on The Tonight Show into entertainment gold. Gabor knew it, and she exploited it relentlessly. Johnny Carson understood her television value perfectly. He also understood something else. Whenever she was booked, the entire crew had to brace themselves. Not because she was difficult in the typical artist way, but because everything around her had a tendency to slip out of control. The chaos began with details that seemed trivial until they weren't. According to staff, Gabor's list of demands arrived early and was written in a tone that allowed no negotiation. The dressing room temperature had to be at one exact number, not around there, but precise. Fresh orchids had to be on the table, absolutely no other flowers. The water had to be Perrier, and the glass had to contain exactly 3 ice cubes. Not 2, not 4. A guest coordinator later said that the first time they read the list, they thought it was a joke. But Zsa Zsa Gabor never joked about her priorities. On one taping, the makeup department discovered they didn't have the exact foundation Gabor used. Her reaction wasn't to accept a substitute. She refused to go on stage and demanded someone drive immediately to Beverly Hills to buy the correct product. The taping stalled. Other guests waited. The crew stood on set, no one daring to make a call. Carson had to intervene. One producer recalled Carson calling Gabor directly, his voice equal parts soothing and exhausted, telling her she already looked perfect and that the show could not stop for a cosmetic crisis. Gabor finally came out like she had just granted them a favor, but that still wasn't what bothered Carson most. On another occasion, Gabor arrived nearly 40 minutes late. No apology, no explanation. And when she finally showed up, her first complaint wasn't about the inconvenience she'd caused, it was about how the show introduced her name. With Gabor, everything revolved around Gabor. What put Carson in a bind was a paradox he understood too well once the cameras were rolling. Zsa Zsa Gabor truly was television gold. She was charming, she was funny, she made audiences laugh. In television, that often buys forgiveness for almost anything. But Carson never confused entertainment with character. He once joked to his executive producer that if Gabor kept going like this, the show should be renamed The Tonight Show, starring Zsa Zsa Gabor, and he would happily play the supporting role. It sounded like humor, but to those who knew Carson, it was a tired confession. Unlike others on Carson's blacklist, Zsa Zsa Gabor wasn't banned outright. She wasn't forbidden, she wasn't strictly limited. But she was placed into a very specific category guests Carson tolerated for their ratings value, not because he respected them. To Carson, Gabor represented a different kind of ugliness, not violence, not direct cruelty, but selfishness, coated in glamour and the emotional manipulation of an entire crew just to serve one person's ego. She didn't need to shout, she only needed to make everyone wait. And in live television, making others wait is power. Carson understood that, and he understood that some people don't destroy a show through aggression only by forcing everything to orbit around them. But if Zsa Zsa Gabor exhausted Carson through repeated chaos, the next name brought another kind of instability, not wrapped in charm or laughter, but in unpredictable explosions. Because after Zsa Zsa Gabor, Johnny Carson had to face Shelley Winters, a storm. No one, not even he, could ever be sure would blow in which direction. Shelley Winters, the woman who never allowed silence. "Some guests make me lose control of the show," Johnny Carson once said, "and some make silence itself impossible." In Hollywood history, Shelley Winters was never an easy name to swallow. 2 Oscars, a career spanning from sensual roles to harsh, gritty characters. The public called her blunt. The press called her fierce. In an industry built on polish, Winters took pride in never softening herself to fit anyone else. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson knew it wouldn't be a gentle conversation. But he didn't fully anticipate the level of chaos Winters could create not only on air, but in the entire space around her. The problem with Shelley Winters didn't begin with insult. It began with domination. Directors recalled Winters had a habit of turning seemingly harmless questions about a new film, a recent role, into long political speeches. No warning, no exit. Carson, famous for controlling rhythm, was often forced into a reactive position. He tried jokes, tried transitions. Winters didn't stop. One director said, "With Shelley, you don't lead the conversation. You just wait for it to end." During one taping in the mid-1970s, Winters transformed a question about cinema into a 5-minute monologue about government media and America's hypocrisy. The studio froze. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. Carson checked the clock, then looked to the producer, one of the rare moments he truly lost control. But what worried the crew wasn't only her words. Winters was known for physical outbursts. The story of her throwing a drink in Oliver Reed's face on a British talk show after he made a crude remark spread quickly through television circles. For Carson's team, it wasn't a funny anecdote. It was a warning. Whenever Winters was booked, the stage was prepared differently. A stage manager said fragile objects would mysteriously disappear from the set. Glasses, decorations, anything that could be knocked over or thrown was removed. Not because they were certain Winters would cause a scene, but because no one could be sure she wouldn't. Carson could see that tension clearly, and it made him uneasy. Privately, he told producers that Winters made him feel like he was sitting beside a live explosive, never knowing when it would detonate. But unlike other names on his list, Carson didn't blacklist Shelley Winters out of contempt. The reason was simple. Winters didn't pretend. She didn't change personalities when the red light came on. She didn't soften her voice to seem sweeter. She didn't act harmless. All her intensity, all her anger, all her controversial opinions were her on and off camera. After one particularly tense taping, Carson turned to a producer and said in a rare tone of reluctant concession, "I don't want to vacation with her, but I believe she means every word she says." To Carson, Winters represented another kind of bad, not manipulation, not falseness, but the imposition of oneself onto shared space, regardless of consequence. She didn't break the show because her ego demanded worship. She broke it because she refused to be silent even if it made everyone else uneasy. That was why Winters remained one of the few guests who irritated Carson, but didn't earn his scorn. He invited her less. He prepared more carefully when she came. But he never erased her entirely. Because for Johnny Carson, the most unbearable thing wasn't noise. It was hypocrisy wrapped in a smile. And if Shelley Winters exhausted him with uncompromising bluntness, the next name enraged him for a different kind of ugliness, cold, deliberate, and aimed directly at vulnerable people. Because after Shelley Winters, Johnny Carson had to face Jane Russell. Jane Russell, when belief becomes a red line. I can tolerate ego eccentricity, even bad habits, but I will never accept contempt for human beings. In Hollywood's memory, Jane Russell wasn't only a sex symbol. She was power, a woman forged in an era when beauty meant status, and status meant you could say what others didn't dare. Russell carried the image of a tough, confident star who never shied away from confrontation. The public viewed her with admiration. The industry indulged her with silence. When Jane Russell appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, Johnny Carson welcomed her as living Hollywood history. On air, she was sharp charming, every inch the legend still commanding weight. Nothing suggested this would be the last time she ever sat in that familiar chair. But the problem with Jane Russell wasn't on camera. According to multiple backstage staff, Russell arrived with an attitude that tightened the air instantly, not because she was loud, but because her coldness was selective. She treated people differently based on whether she considered them worthy. During a taping in the early 1970s, Russell flatly refused to let a male makeup artist touch her face after learning he was gay. No hesitation. No softening. She demanded a replacement, immediately stunning the crew. No one reacted publicly. No one wanted trouble with an icon like Jane Russell. But Johnny Carson heard it. Carson wasn't the kind of host who turned his studio into a moral battleground. He kept The Tonight Show neutral for years, but there were things he didn't classify as personal opinion. One talent coordinator recalled Russell repeatedly making contemptuous remarks about LG+ people backstage, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a tone of casual disdain as if it were self-evident truth. Carson was especially sensitive to that. Not for public image reasons, but because some of the people he trusted most on his crew belonged to that community. For Carson, this wasn't politics. It was humanity. The breaking point came in 1973. During a commercial break after the cameras were off, Jane Russell dismissed the newly passed civil rights laws with open contempt. Not debate, not critique. A blunt rejection of the idea that the vulnerable deserved protection. Those words never aired, but they reached enough ears. And they reached Johnny Carson's. According to those present, Carson didn't react in the moment. He didn't argue. He didn't correct her on the spot. But from that second, a decision was made. Jane Russell was never invited back to The Tonight Show. No press release, no public announcement, no drama. Just a name that quietly vanished from the guest list, something extremely rare for a star of her stature. One producer later said plainly, "That wasn't a ratings decision. That was a principle decision." Carson rarely banned anyone. He could tolerate difficult personalities. He could ignore many egos. But with Jane Russell, he saw a line that had been crossed: discrimination not fueled by temper, but by a cold personal conviction. To Carson, that kind of ugliness was more dangerous. Not explosive, not noisy, but persistent, systemic, and convinced of its own righteousness. Jane Russell didn't lose her career because of that decision. She remained an icon in film history. But in Johnny Carson's world, she was erased from the space he controlled, not because she inconvenienced the show, but because she harmed the people behind it. Carson once said, "You'll know who someone is by how they treat those without power." And Jane Russell gave him a very clear answer. But if Jane Russell forced Carson to draw a red line because of exclusionary belief, the final name on his list chilled him, for another reason entirely. Hypocrisy, when someone builds a public image of compassion on stage but treats human beings like objects backstage. Because after Jane Russell, Johnny Carson had no doubts left about Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis, when the public image is only a performance. In a city full of fakes, he still stood out because of how toxic he was. That was one of the rare lines Carson didn't soften with humor, and the man who drew it out of him was Jerry Lewis. To millions of Americans, Jerry Lewis was compassion personified, the nation's comedian, the man forever tied to telethons raising money for children with serious illnesses. A symbol the public trusted almost automatically. When Lewis stepped onto a stage, he carried a perfectly framed image of kindness. Johnny Carson welcomed Jerry Lewis that way too, at least on camera. But behind the curtain, Carson saw someone else entirely. According to longtime Tonight Show staff, Jerry Lewis was one of the most unpleasant guests they ever dealt with, not because he was eccentric, but because he was deliberate. Lewis didn't hide his contempt for people he considered unimportant. Even on air, he began breaking boundaries. He constantly cut Carson off, seized control of the conversation, and turned questions meant for other guests into his personal stage. On one taping, Lewis even reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without asking, an act that made the entire studio freeze. For Carson, that was unacceptable. He was famously private about being touched without permission. One producer later said Lewis knew that perfectly well, which meant it wasn't an accident, it was a power move. But what disgusted Carson most didn't happen on camera. During a rehearsal, a cameraman coughed quietly without interrupting anything. Jerry Lewis stopped the entire taping. He turned on the cameraman and unleashed a barrage of insults, calling him amateur, unprofessional, and demanded he be removed from the studio. The reason? Breathing too loudly. A floor manager later confirmed he wasn't yelling because of a technical mistake. He was yelling to humiliate. Lewis didn't bother learning staff names. He referred to people by function, camera, makeup, that guy. Age, experience, position, it didn't matter. To him, they existed only to serve, and if they failed to please him, they were degraded immediately. What Carson couldn't stomach was the brutal contrast between that man and the image Jerry Lewis presented to the public. A man who could cry on television for children, then hours later treat adults like trash. Carson didn't see that as temperament. He saw it as character, a two-faced nature. One producer recalled Johnny watched Jerry hug sick kids on a telethon, then come onto our show and treat crew like they weren't human. After Jerry Lewis's final appearance in the early 1980s, Carson didn't debate. He didn't weigh ratings. He simply told the executive producer one sentence: never again. Jerry Lewis became one of the very few people permanently erased from The Tonight Show. No public explanation, no noise, just a door shut for good. Years later, at a private dinner, when someone mentioned Jerry Lewis, Carson repeated the verdict that silenced the table. In a city full of fakes, he still stood out because of how toxic he was. It was the coldest ending on Carson's list. Not because Jerry Lewis lacked talent, not because he didn't bring ratings, but because for Johnny Carson, kindness could not be a role you played only when the audience was watching. And when the lights went out, Jerry Lewis revealed what Carson could never forgive: a man whose compassion existed only in front of spectators. Johnny Carson never exposed anyone on air. He simply remembered and withdrew his trust. For more than 30 years, every star had to pass through that chair to enter America's living room. And there Carson saw what the public never saw: how they treated people without power. 9 names, 9 idols once worshipped, and 9 moments when Johnny Carson learned a simple truth: fame doesn't conceal character, it magnifies it. If you find this list worth thinking about, hit like so the video reaches more people. Comment below and tell us which name shocked you most. And subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next video we'll expose an 80s family sitcom where the laughter on air concealed backstage nightmares so severe the crew had to install an emergency alarm button. See you next time.